Do your photos look like this? Then do not worry, because you've come to the right place, as I'm going to show you how to turn your under or overexposed photos into something that looks like this, using a technique called bracketing, aka exposure blending. And in the end, I'll show you how to very easily blend everything together in Lightroom. Let's get into this. So exposure blending, it sounds scary, right? The concept is actually pretty simple, and I'm going to explain everything in this video. But first, let me tell you why bracketing is needed. Modern cameras nowadays have pretty good dynamic range, usually between 10 to 14 stops, which is the ratio between the darkest and brightest points of the image. In theory, if the scene you're trying to capture is within the range of 10 to 14 stops, then you should have no trouble bringing back that hidden detail. But what if your scene exceeds those 10 to 14 stops of dynamic range? This is when you will start to notice clipping in your highlights or shadows, sometimes even both. Clipping is essentially lost detail that cannot be recovered, and no amount of editing can fix that. Even if your highlights and shadows are fine, pushing them too far can reveal noise and color cast in the shadows. You may also experience slight loss of saturation in the highlights as well. But what you can do in the field is recognize this and capture your scene using bracketing or exposure blending, which will let you perfectly bring back all that highlight and shadow detail back in post. You may also be wondering, well, how do I recognize when to do this? And the answer lies in the histogram. If all of your data is sitting right in the middle of the histogram, something like this, then this is the perfect recipe that you need to capture your scene in one frame. However, if your histogram looks something like this or this, then bracketing is the perfect technique for you. We can understand this a little better in Lightroom if we enable these two clipping markers here above the histogram. These let you know if any parts of your image are clipping, as shown here. Any clipped shadows will be shown in blue, and any clipped highlights will be shown in red. So how does bracketing work? Essentially, you're capturing a series of different exposures. Most people will usually capture brackets consisting of 3 photos, but you can also capture 5 or 7 image brackets for more complex image blending. The process is rather simple. You will capture one underexposed photo revealing all the highlight detail, one overexposed photo revealing all the shadow detail, and then finally one middle exposure capturing all your midtones, and then blending them in Lightroom to create a HDR or high dynamic range image. One thing to keep in mind is when capturing your brackets is to notice any potential wind in the area. The reason being is because we will be capturing multiple frames with slower shutter speeds to let in as much light as possible, and any wind could potentially move trees, branches or grass, adding motion blur to the shot, which could make the blending process a little more tricky. If you realize there is slight wind, then you could try increasing your shutter speed to freeze any motion, as well as increasing your ISO to compensate for the loss of light. However, if you realize one of your shots does have slight motion blur, then there is a solution for this in Lightroom, which I will go over, so make sure to stick around for that at the end of the video, or alternatively, skip ahead to the Lightroom chapter. Choice is yours. If there is no wind, then this does leave the option available to potentially capture all 3 frames handheld. Now this is possible, but it does require a steady hand. I've done this several times before and it's worked absolutely fine. Alternatively, you can use a tripod. Now that you know what bracketing is and why it is needed, I'm going to share with you 2 ways to capture your brackets. And they are auto bracketing or manual bracketing. But which one do you choose? Personally, I always use manual bracketing, but before I go into exactly how I do that, let's first talk about auto bracketing. Auto bracketing is essentially when you use the built-in bracketing system in your camera to adjust your camera settings. To do this, you need to head over to your Drive menu, which can be found by pressing the menu button on the back of your Sony camera and navigating to the first menu and moving across to the 3rd page. Or alternatively, you can press the function button or FN button on the back of your camera and using the left D-pad to scroll over to the Drive menu, which for me is located in the top left. You can then scroll down to the options BRKC or BRKS. Now, you might be wondering what C and S stand for. Well, C stands for continuous, meaning when you press the shutter, it will continuously capture your bracket photos with one click. S, on the other hand, stands for single, meaning you're going to have to manually click the shutter for each frame. The other options to consider are how many stops of dynamic range you want to under or overexpose by. Now, there are multiple options here which can all look a bit confusing, so I'll go over what they mean right now. When you select your bracket options, you're going to see something that looks like this. Now, going from left to right, we already know that this BRKC stands for continuous bracket. The 1.0 EV means how many stops of dynamic range you're going to under and overexpose by, with 1.0 being one stop under or overexposed. The 3 images is how many images you'll be capturing. For example, one middle exposure, one underexposure, and one overexposure. It's also important to know that from 0.3 EV all the way to 1.0 EV, you can take anywhere from 3 to 9 image brackets. However, increasing to 2.0 EV and 3.0 EV, you will only be able to capture 3 to 5 image bracket exposures. So the more you overexpose by, the smaller the bracket you're able to capture, if that makes sense. You can also change which order you want these under and overexposures to happen by going to the first menu and scrolling over to the third page and selecting bracket settings. Here you can change the order of the bracket. A little side note, it is also here that you can enable the self timer if you don't have an intervalometer, as this can help minimize any micro jitters. When you're ready to press the shutter button, your camera will then proceed to take 3 or more photos depending on how many you set it to take. It will capture your middle exposure, your under, and then your overexposure, depending on which order that you set. Now, while auto bracketing does a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to capturing a HDR image, it might not always be the best option to use, as you will usually be capturing 3 photos or more at a time, rapidly filling up your memory card. As said before, I always prefer to do this manually, allowing me to capture just 2 frames if needed. So how do I do that? Well, it's a lot easier than you might think. All I do to achieve this is to keep my camera in manual mode and adjust my camera settings as I usually would, using my camera's histogram to get a good all-round middle exposure. I then want to capture my overexposed image, which will let me recover all that shadow detail in post. To do this, I want to look at my histogram and adjust the shutter speed until the data moves away from the right-hand side of the graph. Something like this. Again, it's at this point that the highlights will most likely be extremely blown out and completely unrecoverable. This, however, is completely normal. Next up, we need to capture our underexposed image. To do this, again, we need to adjust our shutter speed. This time though, moving our histogram data away from the left-hand side of the graph. This will now crush all of our shadows in the image. However, it will allow us to retain all of our highlight detail. This is exactly what we want. The histogram is going to be your best friend in this situation because it will show you the actual image data, whereas looking at the back of your screen on your camera definitely is not as reliable. Now, whether you're capturing auto or manual brackets, this little bonus tip could definitely prevent any headaches. If your camera is set to autofocus continuous, it will be a good idea to set your focus point before taking any photos. After doing this, put your camera into manual focus. This will mean that your camera will not search or change its focus during the capturing of your brackets. Or alternatively, you can change your autofocus setting to autofocus single. So congratulations, you are now able to capture a HDR image that is ready for blending. Let's now jump into Lightroom and show you just how easy it is to blend these exposures together. So I've got all my photos in Lightroom now. As you can see here, my exposures for my highlights, shadows, and midtones. First off, let's highlight all of our exposures. We then need to right click, hover over photo, merge, and then select HDR. This window will then pop up. Here you need to make sure auto align is checked. Below that we have a setting called auto settings, which will apply a very basic grade to the HDR. I always leave this unchecked though, because I prefer to do all my own editing myself and not have Lightroom do it for me. Now, the dego settings are very helpful. If after capturing your photos you realise that there are some slight motion blur in the shot due to any wind moving trees or grass, we can correct this using these deghost options. If this is the case, then you can mess around with the different strengths here to reduce that motion blur. All we have to do now is select OK. This will then create our HDR image. If we go over to the global adjustments and mess around with the highlights and shadows, we can see just how much detail this technique has allowed us to capture, from the brightest highlights to the darkest shadows. Now that the blending process is complete, this is the part where you can finalize your edit and get it looking the way you want. This is such a powerful technique that all photographers need to know. However, there is a negative of creating HDR images, and to put it simply, when you blend multiple exposures together, it can remove a lot of definition in the photo and can often make your photos look quite flat. This can be accentuated, especially when you push the highlights and shadow sliders even further, as shown here. And in actual fact, what you want to do is bring back some of those highlights and shadows back into the photo just before they start clipping. This will give your photo a lot more definition, shape, and overall mood. While there are negatives with HDR, these are all easily fixed. Bracketing your photos is just such a powerful technique to master. By the way, if you want me to create a video on how to do a HDR focus stack, as combining both these techniques can really take your photos to that next level, let me know in the comments down below. Learning this technique has allowed me to become a lot more confident as a photographer. I now know that when I get presented with these difficult lighting conditions, I know how to work around them and come away with something truly spectacular. And after watching this video, you can too. Anyway, if this video has helped you transform your photos, drop it a like so it can help more people just like you. With that said, like, subscribe and hit that bell notification to be notified when a new video does go live. And as always, I'll see you next week for the next one.